At 4 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern Time, on July 20th, American aircraft and warships began moving against Iran for the 10th night in a row. Command centers and missile and drone launch sites, air defense systems along the coast. By 9 that evening, 5 hours later, U.S. Central Command posted the same short line it had posted 9 nights running. Mission complete. Iranian state media reported explosions in Sirak, Bandar Abbas, Qeshm Island, Shiraz, and Isfahan. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the White House was quietly trying to schedule a dignified transfer ceremony at Dover Air Force Base, the ritual where flag-draped coffins come home for soldiers killed 3 days earlier defending a base in Jordan. That ceremony kept getting pushed back. The exact day and time are still being finalized. The press secretary wrote, 10 nights in, 17 Americans dead, nearly 100 wounded in the span of 2 weeks. And the strange thing about night 10 is that it barely made news at all, because by the 10th night of anything, even a war, it starts to look like routine. No special coverage broke in, no emergency address to the nation, just another CENTCOM statement posted late in the evening in almost exactly the same words as the one before it. And the one before that, if you've only half followed this since the ceasefire collapsed, the story you've probably absorbed goes something like this. Iran attacked a U.S. base, so the U.S. is hitting back hard every night. Until Iran can't threaten shipping through the Strait of Hormuz anymore. That's the story CENTCOM tells in almost identical language after every strike. It's not false. It's also not the whole picture, because underneath 10 nights of mission, complete statements, is a much messier story about how often America's own defenses are the ones failing and who's actually paying for that. It's also not a story confined to Iran's own coastline anymore. Since the ceasefire broke down, Iran has spread its retaliation deliberately across the region rather than concentrating it in one place. Missile and drone attacks on U.S. positions and host nation infrastructure in Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain, alongside Saudi Arabia, turning what began as a fight over Iranian nuclear and military sites into a multi-front exchange, touching nearly every American base within range. Analysts watching the pattern describe it as a strategic choice rather than absorb the nightly bombing campaign and hit back at a single target. Tehran is forcing Washington to defend a much wider map, stretching interceptor batteries and radar coverage thinner across more places at once. Start with what actually happened on the ground. On July 17th, an Iranian ballistic missile attack hit Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan. Secretary of State Marco Rubio later said U.S. systems intercepted most of the incoming fire, but one missile, in his words, leaked through. 2 Army air defense soldiers were killed. First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan, 25 of Iwa Beach, Hawaii, and PVT Isabella Gonzalez, 19 of Carrollton, Texas. 4 more were wounded and later discharged from hospitals in Jordan. Investigators recovered a 3rd set of remains at the site that took days to identify. That same weekend, a separate American service member was killed in northern Iraq during the controlled detonation of an Iranian drone that hadn't gone off on impact. By the following Monday, the Pentagon had confirmed a 4th death in the same run of days. The total American death toll in this restarted phase of the war climbed to 17. Feehan and Gonzalez weren't infantry or pilots. They were air defense soldiers, the people whose entire job is operating and maintaining the systems built to stop exactly the kind of missile that killed them. Feehan, 25, was from Iwa Beach on Oahu. Gonzalez, 19, from Carrollton, a suburb outside Dallas, was barely a year removed from high school. The Pentagon's confirmation of their identities came 3 days after strike standard practice while next of kin are notified, which is part of why the story of Night 10 barely registered publicly by the time it arrived. The country was still absorbing news of soldiers who died the previous week. The wounded numbers are just as telling, and they come straight from the Pentagon's own spokesman. Sean Parnell told reporters that almost 100 people had some degree of injury in the 2 weeks since the ceasefire broke down on July 7th, and he added 96% of them had already returned to duty. That's the actual shape of this stretch of the war, not one catastrophic night, but a steady, grinding drip of casualties that Washington keeps rounding down to manageable, even as the number keeps climbing every few days. Why is this happening now, 10 nights and roughly 2 weeks into round 2 of a war everyone thought had ended in June? Because the thing that was supposed to hold, a 14-point ceasefire memorandum brokered by Pakistani, Qatari, and Omani mediators after weeks of quiet diplomacy, didn't. Vice President J.D. Vance announced it had been digitally signed on June 14th, 2 days later, President Trump signed a hard copy in person over dinner at the Palace of Versailles, a moment of real ceremony for an agreement meant to hold for 60 days and close the book on the war for good. It lasted 23 of those 60 days. Iran struck 3 commercial vessels that had drifted outside an approved Brad shipping lane in the Strait of Hormuz on July 7th. President Trump said the next day that he considered the truce over. Within 10 more days, Iran had hit a U.S. base directly for the first time since the truce and killed American soldiers doing their jobs. Since then, it's been nightly. American strikes on Iranian military infrastructure framed explicitly around one strategic goal: reopening a waterway that normally carries something like a fifth of the world's traded oil, and that U.S. forces say they've kept open for roughly 900 commercial vessels and 450 million barrels of crude since May, even while the fighting continues around it. Here's a lens worth carrying through the rest of this story, because it explains almost everything about why a war fought mostly with high-tech interceptors keeps producing American casualties. No missile shield is actually a wall. It's a filter. Patriot batteries, THAAD systems, layered radar, they're built to catch the overwhelming majority of what's fired at them, not all of it, and no manufacturer or general has ever claimed otherwise in public. Defense analysts watching this war have pointed out that Iran doesn't need to beat American air defenses outright. It just needs enough missiles, drones, and decoys coming from different angles and different speeds that a small percentage gets through the filter. Cheap decoys flown alongside real warheads, staggered launch timing, and mixed trajectories all exist for exactly this purpose: to make a defense system spend its attention and its limited interceptors on threats that turn out to be nothing, so that the real one slips through in the gap. Even when systems work exactly as designed and intercept the vast majority of incoming fire, a small number penetrating the defensive shield can inflict considerable casualties. As one analyst put it, multiply that arithmetic by 10 nights, 20 nights, 60 nights, and the small percentage stops being small. It becomes Tyler Feehan and Isabella Gonzalez. There's an older, uglier version of this same lesson that the U.S. military learned the hard way once before, and it's worth knowing because it quietly repeated itself earlier in this exact war. In 2003, during the invasion of Iraq, a Patriot battery near Karbala misclassified a returning U.S. Navy jet's radar signature as an incoming Iraqi anti-radiation missile. A second Patriot battery reached the same false conclusion. The system's targeting criteria were simply too broad for the environment it was operating in, and lives were nearly lost to America's own defenses instead of the enemy's. 23 years later, on March 2nd, 2026, day 3 of this war, it happened again. Kuwaiti air defenses, built around the same Patriot architecture, misidentified 3 American F-15E Strike Eagles as hostile aircraft in the middle of an Iranian missile and drone barrage and shot all 3 of them down. All 6 aircrew ejected safely. President Trump, asked about it weeks later, called it a little mishap. They shot down 3 planes with our missiles, he told reporters. They happened to be our planes. An Air Force investigation would later point to a chain of failures: misidentification by the pilots, a breakdown in oversight from the AWS crew monitoring the airspace, and transponder systems that didn't function as intended in a crowded, chaotic battle picture. The Pentagon's own shield, in other words, has already turned on itself once in this war. It just didn't kill anyone that time. To be fair to the people running this campaign, there's a real defensible case behind the strategy, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than waved away. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has argued consistently that the war has been a strategic success, that Iran's Navy, Air Force, and defense industrial base have been rendered largely ineffective, that 9 Iranian naval vessels were sunk in a single early operation, and that the nightly strikes since July have specifically degraded the command and control and radar networks. Iran needs to threaten shipping on its own terms. That argument has real evidence behind it. Hundreds of Iranian targets destroyed, a partial reopening of tanker traffic through the strait, a regime stripped of much of the hardware it had going into February. The gap in that argument surfaced in public, under oath, in a Senate hearing that got far less attention than it deserved. Senator John Ossoff asked Hegseth directly whether his claim made back on day 14 of the war that Iran's military had been functionally destroyed and made combat ineffective was actually accurate. It was a pointed, simple question, the kind meant to have a yes or no answer, and it didn't get one. Hegseth didn't walk the claim back exactly, but he didn't defend it cleanly either. He called the war a historic military victory and then conceded in the same breath, "We never expected they would stop having capabilities to shoot." That's the sentence that actually explains Night 10, an acknowledgement under direct Senate questioning that destroyed and still capable of killing Americans were never actually in conflict, even though the original claim was delivered as if they were. A military can be devastated, its navy sunk, its air defenses in ruins, and still retain just enough scattered capability, a truck-mounted launcher here, a scattered squad of drone operators there, to keep killing American soldiers one leaked missile at a time. Victory and still losing people every few days turned out not to be contradictory statements. They're both true at once. And Night 10 is what that combination looks like from the ground. Zoom out, and the stakes here go well past any single night strike count. This war has now stretched across nearly 5 months, pulled in Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia as secondary battlegrounds, and cost thousands of lives on the Iranian side alone. By independent estimates, alongside the mounting American toll, Congress has already approved a $95 billion package to keep funding the renewed fighting. Every additional night of strikes is also, quietly, an additional night of munitions spending, interceptor missiles that can't simultaneously restock air defense batteries watching other flashpoints around the world, and political pressure building on an administration that entered this month insisting the war was basically over. The economics run in both directions. The entire American strategy for these 10 nights has been built around one number: keeping the Strait of Hormuz open for the roughly fifth of the world's seaborne oil that normally passes through it. Every night CENTCOM can point to tankers moving is treated as evidence the campaign is working. But interceptor missiles cost real money and take real time to manufacture. Earlier in this war, a U.S. senator noted that American forces fired more Patriot interceptors in the conflict's opening days than the country had sent Ukraine over 4 full years, and everyone fired at an Iranian missile over Jordan or Kuwait is one that isn't. Sitting in a battery somewhere else in the world, Iran, for its part, continues to frame the entire campaign as a defensive response to what its officials call an unprovoked assault on its sovereignty and nuclear program, a position most of the international community outside the U.S. and its closest allies has treated with real skepticism about civilian harm. Put the last 2 weeks together and a clear picture forms. This isn't a story about one battle, one base, or even one missile that leaked through. It's a story about what happens when a war stops being an event and becomes a schedule, when 10th consecutive night is a phrase officials can say almost on autopilot, when a filter built to catch 90-some% of incoming fire is, by design, guaranteed to eventually let something through. And when the honest answer to did we win and the honest answer to are people still dying turn out to both be yes, delivered by the same defense secretary in the same hearing. Even the friendly fire incident in March fits the pattern once you see it. An air defense system doesn't have to be beaten by the enemy to fail. Sometimes it just has to be operating in a battle space, crowded enough, chaotic enough, and fast-moving enough that the machine or the person reading it gets the picture wrong. 10 nights of bombing runs and one ceasefire that lasted 23 days are both symptoms of the same underlying fact. Nobody involved in this war on either side has actually found a way to make it stop. So what's actually worth watching from here, instead of just counting nights? First, the Dover ceremony, a small human detail that keeps getting delayed, and worth watching for what it signals about how this administration wants the war's cost presented publicly versus how it's actually unfolding day to day. Second, watch the Strait of Hormuz shipping numbers, specifically. As long as CENTCOM keeps citing vessel counts and barrels moved as the campaign's success metric, that's the number that will determine how much longer nights like this one continue. Third, watch whether Congress holds another hearing like Asaf's, because that exchange, more than any strike footage, is the moment this war's official narrative and its actual daily cost was said out loud, back to back, by the same man and fourth watch. Whether the pattern of casualties shifts from air defense soldiers and downed pilots towards something larger, a mass casualty event at a single base. The kind of single night that would actually break through the routine, the way 10 separate nights of gradual losses and haven't. There's a detail worth sitting with from the ceremony that kept getting postponed. 2 soldiers who spent their careers operating air defense systems, the exact technology meant to stop a night like July 17 from happening, were killed by the one missile that got past it. The system worked by every by every technical measure almost every single time. It just didn't work, the one time that mattered to their families. That's the actual shape of Night 10 and Night 11, and however many more come after it. Not a single disaster, but an accumulation, one leaked missile, one misidentified jet, one delayed ceremony at a time. I'll keep tracking this one, the casualty count, the Hormuz numbers, whatever comes out of the next hearing, and if that's useful, stick around for the next update.